Hey, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of Inside Today's Boardroom from Diligent Institute, your source for the latest and greatest in corporate governance, all in 10 minutes. I'm your host, Lisa Edwards, Executive Chair of Diligent Institute, and today I'm joined by Dave Stainback. Dave is a leader from PwC, where he runs the U.S. Territory Crisis and Resilience segment. Dave, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Lisa. Great to be here.
So, Dave, I couldn't be more excited for this topic because my friends call me Captain Worst Case Scenario. So I have this amazing earthquake kit out here in Northern California. And I'm super jealous because I think effectively you get to do this as your job. So your role at PwC is around both the building of the resilience and doing that proactively, and also the crisis response. And, the goal in being resilient isn't anticipating the thing, as we all know, that will be the actual disruptor, but it's really sort of how do you demonstrate capability in handling the crisis. So maybe just talk to us a little bit about how you think about this topic and where you see companies doing well and where you see them kind of needing more room for improvement.
Yeah, sure. So I could not agree more with you. And I think it's really helpful to start with the backdrop of the current corporate climate, really in this, honestly, an era of disruption that we're in here. I think we all feel the pace and scale of disruption is really increasing, but we also have data that supports that. We run a global crisis and resilience survey here at PwC every couple of years. And if you go back to our 2019 study, just 5 years ago, only 69% of our respondents told us that they experienced a major corporate crisis or disruption over the prior 5-year period. But in our survey that we just conducted last year in 2023, that number rose to 96% that have faced a similar severity type of an event over just the prior 2 years. And if you take the pandemic out of that completely, it's still 91% over the prior 2 years. So I think we're seeing more frequent disruption. And I think also the types of disruptions are unpredictable, right? You've got cyber and ransomware, you have geopolitical issues, you have supply chain and climate. And so businesses are so much more reliant on their broader ecosystem that they're facing more and more challenges more frequently. And so the bottom line is disruptions happening more frequently and with greater impact. And frankly, trying to predict and plan for exactly what disruption may face you, kind of like you talked about, is a little bit of a mistake, right? And so instead, it's more important to build a resilience program, in our view, that is threat agnostic. And that's not to say that you shouldn't have a strong risk management program that's really evaluating what risks you may face. That's clearly an important input. But leading organizations aren't over-rotating on that. The most strategic organizations that we see are actually laser focused on a simple concept. And that's identifying the core services you deliver as a company that would have the most significant impact on your stakeholders should you not be able to perform them, even for a short period of time. And so once you've identified those, you really work to make sure that that small number of core services can be as resilient as it can possibly be. And that's putting in place contingency plans, continuity strategies, workarounds, recovery capabilities, things like that. If you think about it, it's very logical. And in the end, it helps you spend your resilience dollars much more wisely, rather than trying to solve for every possible threat scenario. So the reality is that the challenge with that is it's a simple concept, but doing it is actually a significant effort, right? And so in most cases, it requires companies to kind of rethink and retool their resilience programs as they have them today. And it's not something that can be done kind of at the flip of a switch. It usually takes, probably a 2-year commitment. So it's really important to have senior management and really a C-suite and board commitment that you're going to get that done.
Yeah, it's super interesting because, I work with a lot of companies on talking through some of their cybersecurity issues. And obviously, that is one of many, many things, as you noted, supply chain and macroeconomics and, health and safety of employees in COVID-19 that can go wrong. But, it starts at the same place, which is what are your critical assets and what can you not live without? And this whole notion of resilience of, it's can you really avoid a black swan event that impacts everyone? Nobody could avoid COVID-19, but it's sort of if something happens, how do you get your operations back up, and how do you, kind of keep that ability to deliver product or services to your customers? So it's a super interesting concept that I think is really goes across a lot of things. And we've all seen these headlines where companies, are faced with a crisis And lots of them probably say, look, we have our playbooks, we've done our tabletop exercises, we've got our enterprise risk matrix, like we're totally covered, we got this. But I wonder how many really understand the potential impacts when something actually happens. So can you talk to us about that phenomenon and this need for dependency mapping?
Yes, absolutely. It's a great question. And honestly, this is where a lot of the heavy lifting and the hard work that I just referenced comes into play. Because given the connectivity in business ecosystems today, both with technology and third parties, it's really more challenging than ever for companies to really understand all of their dependencies and therefore their key risks. And so we've seen this recently in the healthcare industry where, like you said, cyber attacks on specific vendors or technology platforms, they've had widespread impacts to frankly, hundreds of different companies. So understanding dependencies is critical to actually building resilience. And if you don't know what applications or third parties support an important business process, how can you ensure that you have the right recovery capabilities, continuity strategies, workarounds in place to withstand the loss of that dependency? So, I mean, frankly, we believe in taking that top down strategic approach to building resilience that I alluded to earlier. And it's frankly the best way to build a resilient organization. If you think about the steps, right, there's a couple of them. There's identifying those critical business services that we talked about. And that's thinking of it as the ability to do something really important, right? Deliver a product, make a payment, the ability to pay our employees, those things that impact our core stakeholder groups. And then you think about each of those critical business services, and a company might have 10 or 12 of those. They will have a bunch of different processes that make up each critical business service. So the first part of dependency mapping is really at the process level. What are the several processes that underpin a particular service? Some might have just a handful, some might have 10 or more processes. And you think of them as nested under the critical business services. And the goal is really to map out how each sub process works together to enable the delivery of that service. And so then once you've done that process level mapping, the next step is really then to take each of the individual processes and break that down into each of their own dependencies as well. And that can be its people that support it that are critical, facilities, and then the ones that really matter most today in our business ecosystem are what applications support each process and what third parties, right? And even with some of those, there are layers of dependencies. That's why this is hard, right? For an application, not only do you need to know an application is critical, but you need to understand all the infrastructure that supports that application. For a third party, you might have to go to some fourth party dependencies as well because those third parties rely on others. And so you can see why really it takes commitment from the top to take this on. But once you've done that, you really have this beautiful mapping of all the core elements that allow you to deliver your most critical services to your stakeholders. And then you can actually move to building out resiliency, redundancy for each of those dependencies so that if one of them is impacted, you have the ability to withstand it or recover from it in a way that won't breach your acceptable levels of impact.
Yeah, I like that. It's kind of like, back in the old school consulting days, I was a consultant back in the day, and we used to do a lot of root cause analysis type thing, and effectively, it's just going down the chain until you get to the first thing and saying, "All right, can we not live without this? And if not, we better protect it." Right? Like it's pretty cool.
Exactly right. It's exactly right.
Well, you work with management teams, obviously, but you also work with boards on some of these issues. I know, and obviously, we've got an audience here of a lot of board members. What are one or two things that you wish that boards knew, or that um, you think that boards, we always sort of prep boards with like, here's what you should ask your management team. Like management teams love this. Like, the board member comes in and is like, hey, what about this? But what are those things? What are the one or two questions that a board member can go in and say, hey, like, have you thought of this? And hopefully get the right answer on.
Yeah, no, we do this quite a bit. And I actually think, the first thing to really start with is there's a lot of confusion and conflation around the terms that are used in the resilience space. And I think it's actually important for boards to understand and make sure that management understands, right, what every company has when it comes to the different resilience disciplines that exist. So think of business continuity, disaster recovery, emergency management, crisis response. Those are all different disciplines. And, a lot of times we'll talk and we'll hear senior leaders really use them interchangeably when in fact they are very unique, right? And they have different purposes. And we can go into those, or we can talk, but we should learn about what each of those capabilities is there for. And so step one is really understanding that those differences exist. And step two is then figuring out how mature they are, right? And more importantly, how well they can actually work together. The reality is, in most companies, the disciplines all reside in different silos or parts of the organization, right? You've got BC over here, you've got disaster recovery over there. So integration and alignment across those disciplines has become paramount, as honestly, the biggest disruptions require them all to work together in sync. And that's where we see a lot of companies really have challenges when they're responding. In our survey, just to highlight this, we saw that 2/3 of companies are actually working on integrating the resilience disciplines into a more centrally governed program, but only 1 in 5 have said that they've completed that integration. So there's a lot of work to do across pretty much all industries. And so when I do talk to boards, right, to your point of what questions should they be asking of management, there's really a handful of things that I think are really paramount for them to think about or ask about. And one is, how integrated is our resilience program? Have we moved to develop central governance to align those different disciplines? Secondly, okay, what level of executive sponsorship exists for that resilience program? In this era of disruption, do we have a C-suite leader who's actually the one that's accountable to make sure that this is in place or not? Thirdly, have we identified those most critical business services that we talked about? And have we thought about the impacts? And do we understand what those impacts would be should we not be able to deliver those services? And then for our most critical services, to what extent have we mapped dependencies and investigated or really invested in strategies to be able to withstand any impacts to them? And then lastly, how do we know? What form of exercising or testing are we doing to regularly find out what gaps we may have in our thinking and try to learn from that? It's really those 4 or 5 core questions that I think boards can be pushing management on.
Yeah, I love the how do we know, right? Like that's so critical in terms of timing. And if a day goes by before we're all able to figure this out, then you have a problem. So tons of great data and really sort of insightful things that I think boards can act on, that management teams can act on. If people want to get a little bit more information about some of the stuff we talked about today, where should I send them? Where do they go?
Sure, yeah, you can go either to PwC's Governance Insight Center or to PwC's Global Center for Crisis and Resilience.
That was great. So everyone check out those PwC resources if you want more details on that, and we will wrap it up there. Thank you, Dave, for those amazing insights.
Thank you, Lisa.
And join us next time for another edition of Inside Today's Boardrooms. Thank you for listening.